Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us, Art Basel Conversations. This conversation is the rise of the SingleArtist Museum. I can tell you're all very excited. This is a good sign. I'm happy to introduce Stein Olaf Henriksen, director of the Munich Museum, Oslo. Thomas Schutte, a celebrated artist based in Düsseldorf. Nina Zimmer, director of the Kunstmuseum Bern and Zentrum Paul Klee. And also our beloved moderator, Andras Santo. Thank you, Andras. Author and curatorial strategy consultant based in New York. So help me welcome them all in a big round of applause.
Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. This is the first time I heard people clapping when we came on stage. So apparently this is all because of Thomas. That's what I'm told. But anyway, thank you very much, Mari and Annelie and Art Basel for organizing these talks. And to all of you for showing up, in a busy afternoon. This is always very gratifying to see that there's an audience for these discussions here at Art Basel. We're here to talk about a unique type of museum, the SingleArtist Museums, museums that are associated mainly with one artist. Every year we think about what kind of subject we haven't yet covered in the world of museums, and somehow we thought this would be a good year to talk about artist museums or single artist museums. And indeed we have the directors of two, very well-established museums devoted to very well-known artists, Klee and Munk, and we have a very well-known artist who has established his own museum where he actually shows other artists as well, but, well, more about that later. There are roughly, if I'm not mistaken, I tried to do some research, about 60 recognized single artist museums in the world. Some of these museums are wildly popular. Think of the Picasso Museum in Paris, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, the Miro Foundation in Barcelona. I was recently at the Schul Solar Museum in one of the most incredible places to visit in Buenos Aires, the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. So some of these are really absolutely seminal, popular touristic destinations. Others are more esoteric. These are museums which are devoted to keeping artists in view of the public, and we'll hear that they have many other functions. They have, I think it's fair to say, unique opportunities in most museums that are devoted to a multiplicity of artists. It's once in every 20 years that you look at a particular artist. In a single artist museum, every month, every year, every day, you're drilling down into that artist and his or her context. They also have some unique responsibilities about which we will also hear, especially if they're involved in research and authentication, which is a minefield of issues, by the way. And of course, they have unique challenges. Well, I guess starting with the question of if I've seen the museum once, how many times do I come back? So it turns out to be a very dynamic and evolving field. And indeed, like everything in the world, it has its own association. There is an association of artist museums. I think you are both members of this. And they have come up with a definition of sorts, which I will now read so we can all reflect on it. It says, the artist, and here behind me, you see a sequence of images which are completely unrelated to the sequence of discussion we will have. It's a kind of wallpaper, but it gives you a sense of what's on inside these three museums. So here's the association's description of this category. The Artist Museum is grounded in the art, archives, biographical complexity of a single creative individual. Holistic and immersive, each artist museum is unique in its relation to its artist, but is always an entry into the living breath of the creative process, a laboratory for examining history through an individual life and vision. The Artist Museum proposes a challenge and alternative to the usual history of art and experience of the public, while generating enrichment and understanding. So this is, some of you were involved in drafting this. I would love to have seen the room where this was crafted. It's quite wonderful. So what I thought we could do is begin. We have only a brief hour, so we'll talk a little bit about, I'm interested in your thoughts and reflections in relation to this and how your respective museums sort of fit this paradigm. And then we have a number of questions we'd like to explore. Maybe some of you have questions, and it will be a beautiful thing. So, Nina, so you're here because of the Centrum Paul Klee, but of course that's all in relation to the Bern Museum of Fine Arts, where, by the way, the Gurlitt collection is now on view, for those of you who have time to get over there. You're extremely experienced curator. You've published a lot of texts. You were at the Hamburg Kunsthalle, and now you have, among your many responsibilities, running this entity. So based on what I said, how does the Klee House fit into this, and what are the unique challenges that you're working on there?
Well, thanks for the invitation, first of all. I was very happy to hear the question, because this is exactly what I'm thinking about with the Paul Klee Museum and the Kunstmuseum. These are sort of two opposite models. The Kunstmuseum is the all-encompassing traditional art museum where you try to span the program over generations from medieval art to contemporary art. And with the Paul Klee, we have a museum that's a young museum that is only 15 years old, and that was invented by the founders as an institution that's dedicated to Paul Klee research, but was already invented as being invented as a cultural center. And Paul Klee's interest in music was taken as a basis for a whole musical program, and his interest in education for an education program. But this museum has evolved. It's had its own history in those 15 years. And what has been, I think, really strong has been the research and the understanding part of that definition you just read out to us. I think we are really the place to go for anybody doing Klee research, and we've ideal conditions for this. But what we have to constantly think about is what kind of programs are we doing around this core Klee research program, and what can an exhibition program be in a city that's a small city, for a museum that's not solely a destination museum.
So how do you define your public for this museum?
We mainly serve Bern and a national Swiss audience, and then we also have an international audience. We have, especially over the summer, Switzerland is a place where many people travel through, mostly in the summer. So we have people who travel sometimes from Japan just to see Paul Klee highlights. And you really want to show them what they came for. They want to see the most famous works from the collection. But then we have an audience in the city of Bern who has lived with this museum, who has seen it in the last 15 years. As you said, not everybody is as crazy as we are about art and wants to go to the Paul Klee Museum constantly. So how do we create a place that really serves the communities around the museum, that serves the city, but that serves a national and an international audience in the right mix and in the right ways, without losing its identity as being a place for the research and development of understanding on Paul Klee.
So give me, just before we move on to Olaf, give me one example of where you got that right, this balancing act that you just described.
So we are particularly happy and proud about a project we did last year, which was called 10 Americans after Paul Klee, which was about Klee reception in the United States, mid-century. And we were able to show that a lot of artists we all know very well, like Jackson Pollock and other American mid-century artists, were deeply interested and inspired by Paul Klee. And this is not so much known. We always look at the connection of French surrealism towards American abstract expressionism, but Paul Klee being part of that surrealism, but more an individualist, was for many of these artists influential. So there was total new research, which Fabian Eckelhofer, the chief curator, did in the US, and we were able to show Paul Klee alongside early work and late work of these 10 artists. And this was an exhibition we developed, and this was taken over by an American museum afterwards. So this was Klee-based, research-based, opened up towards an international reception, and we were able to find a partner in the US, the Phillips Collection in Washington. So this is one example where it worked. And tomorrow we're going to open the Etel Adnan exhibition at the Center Paul Klee. Etel Adnan being one of the foremost Arab modernists as a writer and as a visual artist. And not everybody knows that Paul Klee was her main inspiration as a young woman in Beirut. She stumbled across the diaries of Paul Klee, and that made her discover Paul Klee more and his writing, and helped her foster a relationship that led her to be a writer and a painter in her own way. And she accepted our invitation, which we're very happy about, to be in a dialogue with Paul Klee. So these are the kind of projects we want to develop more.
Great, and then we'll circle back and hear more, but that's one flavor of this kind of museum. But let's talk about another one a little bit further north. Stein, you are director of the Munk Museum since 2010. And it was very interesting, Nina, that you mentioned already music, and I could see Stein was going like this, because you, of course, come from the world of music, having directed the Opera House. And those of you who haven't recently been, who's been, by the way, hands up if you've been to the Klee Centrum? Okay, hands down. Hands up if you've been to the Munk Museum in Oslo. Okay, so maybe some of those early claps were for you. I think it was your... in any case, those of you who might have visited Oslo recently, you would see the contours of an enormous new structure that you're building, highly ambitious new museum that really sort of takes the SingleArtist Museum to a new level. So Munk is obviously Norway's sort of seminal artist. The museum, however, clearly points to much more than Munk. So tell us how you're defining it.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that, well, thank you for inviting me here. Yeah. It's great to be here, always. There are many kinds of SingleArtist museums. When it comes to artist homes, collections, archives, and museum objects. But the Munk Museum is based on the collection of Edvard Munch himself. He basically kept everything throughout his last years in his life. He didn't sell very much. So we have 2/3 of his total production, which is 28,000 artworks by Munch. We also have 15,000 museum objects, which is his painting tubes and his working tools and his archives, his press archive, his sketchbooks, his lithographic stones, 180 lithographic stones. So it's a big collection that is the basis of the new Munk Museum and the old Munk Museum. But I think the reason why we established a network was to look into best practices and some of the, let's say, challenges and opportunities that we have as a SingleArtist Museum. What can we contribute to the artist world that is not already there, so to speak? And I think what we can contribute is a little bit challenging the, let's say, traditional way of looking at art history through one single artist, challenging a little bit the history, going through one individual creative mind at one point, And I think to have this deeper knowledge of creative processes, individual challenges and emphasizes gives art an extra, let's say, value that will also create more deeper, I think, interest in the art and the art experience on a general level. So I think it's very important that we have this mix of different kinds of museums. That some museums are encyclopedic, and some museums are, and they are more like horizontal museums, I would say. And the SingleArtist Museum would be more vertical museums in the sense of being able to go deeper into one specific creative mind. So I think the challenge that we have is, of course, very similar to all other cultural institutions, to be relevant, first of all. But I think we have the challenge of having a wider responsibility for our artists than just running a museum, because we are running a collection, and that is a very big responsibility, I think, to represent one single artist. So we need to do research. We need to make sure that Munk is available all over the world, physically in exhibitions, but also digitally. And we have to make sure that we are developing interest and knowledge about our artists throughout the world. So it's a much wider responsibility in the sense of having a strategy for how you deal with the huge collection that we have. So I think the museum in Oslo is, of course, one tool for the collection, but not the only tool. There are many other ways of dealing with the single artist. So I think the challenge is maybe three main challenges. I would say that to keep the artist, because Munk died 70 years ago, so to keep him alive as an artist, I thought was a very big challenge, because Munk was to some extent looked upon, at least for the local Norwegian population, as a kind of culture, historic person, not an artist necessarily. And his works, especially the iconic works, people went to see them because they were famous, and they brought their friends from abroad to see famous works, icons in the Norwegian art history or history. So we needed to make sure that Munk exists as an artist, that his concerns, his thematics, even his aesthetics, if you like, he stays alive and vibrant. And in that respect, I think it's very important to show Edvard Munch in all kinds of different relations, in a wider, let's say, program, where contemporary art is very, very important. I think we need to have a strong contemporary program. And the reason why we are building a new museum in Oslo, which is 5 times bigger than what we have today, is to have a wider possibility in order to be a vibrant, lively, relevant museum in a contemporary society, to participate in the development of society, and to also keep Edvard Munch's legacy vibrant and alive, and to be able to show his works all over the world, but also in Oslo.
But what struck me, I recently had a chance to look at your plans closely, and when you described it, I think you said there are, I don't know, 8 different parts of the museum where you could do musical events, performances. So this sort of program of expanding the connections really goes beyond interesting curation and mixing with contemporary art. You're really creating, as she was saying, a kind of cultural center around Munch, no?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge as well, but we discussed a lot about the content of the new museum, like the order to the architect, and we decided that we need to show a lot more of the collection than we can do today. We have 1 exhibition site at the old Munch Museum, and it's 7 exhibition sites in the new museum, so it's 10 times bigger, actually, exhibition spaces than we have today. In order to show a lot more of the collection, because that's what we need for the people that comes from all over the world to experience Munch. As you said, Klee, people come from practically everywhere. But we also need to be relevant for our immediate local society, which I would say is Northern Europe. So we also decided to have a concert hall, a cinema, of course, but we have 6 places in the museum that we can do concerts,
6, yeah.
in addition to some of the exhibition spaces that are also wonderful for concerts. But all kinds of programs. We have 3 restaurants, and we want to keep open the museum from 10 to 10. So we want to do every night, and we want to do a program of performance, entertainment, music, of course, but also scientific meetings, artist meetings, curator meetings, all that kind of things that could keep the museum lively and relevant, not only for the local population, but also for people visiting the museum.
And this is opening in 19, right?
We opened the ticket office the 5th of June 2020. But we're
heard it here, 5th of June 2020.
So I wish you all welcome, of
you
course.
You can go straight from Art Basel in 2020 to Oslo. So that's another flavor of a single artist museum. And now we're going to go to something a little bit completely different. What we've been hearing about are various interpretations of sort of keeping the legacy alive of artists who are long dead. But Thomas here is very much alive. However, you have been, I mean, everyone knows your enormous body of work spanning 3 decades. You live and work near Düsseldorf, and it is there that you have created and have opened what you call the Sculpturenhalle, which is a foundation devoted to your legacy, but what you created there is a space where you're also doing an active exhibitions program of other sculptors mainly. So who's been to his museum? Okay, look at all your fans. They're like in the middle. Okay. So tell us, for those of you who didn't have their hands up, tell us a little bit about this place that you've built and what is your long-range plan?
It seems I'm sitting between chairs like quite often. Actually, it's not a museum. It's
a foundation.
It's a foundation with no state money, so we don't burn other people's money. It's a foundation's money. It's designed by myself, 50%, and the other is the artists and the engineers. And actually, we run it as a Kunsthalle, except we don't have a real director. So I count the money and bring it to the bank. I employ people. We carry the cases by ourselves to the basement. And actually, we have no registrar, we have no research. There's some kind of an archive place. But it's a completely different story because it's on low size. It's 600 square meters. We have 1,000 people a month and not much more. And we are in the area of the countryside. And with the neighbor of the Langen Foundation and the Insel Hombroich, and it's, actually my hand is shivering. Because I'm a bit stressed, I'm between chairs.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we like that. I want you to describe, no, because I think we thought it'd be really interesting to have an artist who's actually thinking about creating an institution. I mean, these institutions have been evolving for decades and decades. Maybe you could describe a little bit, as a sculptor, you had the sort of opportunity to sort of design the ideal place for presenting work. So tell us what it looks like and how you've articulated this space.
If it's the ideal space, I really don't know, but it's certainly not a white box. It has no rectangle. It's a curved oval space. It has a little chapel inside. And we do 2 shows a year. Now it's Munoz. Before was Anthony Caro. Before was Paloma Varga Weiss. Before was Richard Deacon. And the opening show was Mario Mert. So half is dead, half is alive. And we do things the other don't do. So we don't compete with MoMA.
Yeah.
MoMA has 1,000 people an hour. We have it in a month. So we can offer quiet places and inside having people giving time to look at it and not just scanning, like what you do on art fairs or on big museums, that you really don't have the time to reflect.
And you have built up a very large volume of works, which you're also storing in this facility, right? And it's made it possible for you to loan out your own works as well.
I rented half of the storage as my company. I rented from the foundation. The foundation has now like 20 pretty big sculptures, but not for sale. Structured the foundation that I can put pieces into the foundation and transfer it into money, tax-free. That's the advantage, that the foundation has a lot of money, or more than our neighbors. And in the winter breaks, we go down to the basement and pull out a handful of things which I haven't seen for 10 years. And we don't do any advertisement. No, except local press, we are pretty much ignored by art press or by big press, pretty much ignored. Not at the opening, there was a lot of things happening. And then we celebrate 2 times a year an opening where the whole art world of the area, and it's still strong, coming. So a couple of thousand people coming through the field, having sandwiches and sausages, and have, till now, a brilliant day. It's not an ego thing. I designed it, and I designed the foundation, and I feeded the foundation. But my idea was actually that simple financial thinking, because I went through a divorce where the opposite lawyer declared the value of my storage on auction prices. Not production price, but auction prices. And this was so frightening, and I agreed actually with the ex-wife that everything's okay, but I had to take care. With 60, you should take care what happened to your kids or what's happened to your work. We found a structure that we can sell on auction prices, but I can save the pieces and keep them together in the framework of a foundation. And the foundation only works without any donation or with any state money. And we charge €5.
Well, what's interesting in all of this is that, as I said before, there are only 60 single artist museums in the world. There have been tens of thousands of artists, and one of the sad facts of life is that most artists, 50, 60 years after they're dead, are in complete obscurity. So one of the things I'd like to come back to later on is this idea of what an artist can do in his lifetime or her lifetime to ensure that there's some continuity. I'm curious, by the way, in the case of Klee and Munk, what were the circumstances that led to the creation of who was the decisive factor in creating? In the case of Munk, it was the legacy of the artist, right?
Munk left all his belongings to the city of Oslo in his testament. That was during the war. So in fact, he wrote his testament and gave everything to the city of Oslo when he was 76 years old. And that was 1 week after the Nazis intook Norway. So he was scared about what they would do to him and his collection. So he decided to give everything to the city of Oslo. And he died 4 years later during the war. And then the city of Oslo spent some years to decide what they wanted to do with this huge collection. And then they decided to create a museum and establish expertise to take care of this collection. And that was opened in 1963. So the museum we have today is 55 years old. I just want to say one thing about the images that you see on the wall behind here, because we are part of a city development project. So the first picture after the Munk Museum is introduced is a new city. Part of the city used to be harbor area. And then this is a museum actually that you see here, made by architect from Madrid, Spanish architect, Juan Herreros. On the left side of the building you see the opera, which is vertical. which is, I mean, horizontal. The museum is vertical. And it's a totally new part of town where it's going to be 30,000 people living and 30,000 people working, actually. So I just wanted to mention that, because if you wonder what you see, and one of the pictures is the old museum, so you might be able to see which that is.
And just financially, and I want to hear about Klee as well, so you are entirely municipal, city of Oslo funded, or what is your revenue picture?
Revenue, we have almost 40% private income, and the 60% is on the running of the museum is from the city entirely. But the building project was also supported by the national budget.
Mm-hmm. So, and in the case of Klee, how did that come about? Was it collectors who ensured that this material is staying intact?
Well, Klee is from Bern, as you might know, and passed away in 1940 in Bern. And after his death, a Klee Foundation was established. And this was part of the Kunstmuseum Bern for a very long time. And there was always an idea to maybe expand the space for the Klee Foundation, because it took on sort of its own dimension and energy, especially when the catalogue Raisonné was about to be published. It generated a lot of particular interest for Klee. And then, thanks to the generous donation of the Müller Foundation, Maurice and Martha Müller Foundation, a building, we had seen it before, Renzo Piano building was possible. And then at this point also the heirs of the Klee family joined in and made a gift to the museum and gave like a large part of the remaining works in the family collection as a permanent loan to the museum. So this helped then to establish the foundation as its own museum, and this is only a good 15 years ago.
And what's your annual budget, and how many visitors do you have?
We have over 120,000 visitors, depending on the exhibition program. And we have a pretty similar breakdown. We have about 40% Eigenfinanzierung, so money we generate by sponsoring our entrance. And we are funded by the county, the canton of Bern, the government, which is our main sponsor. And then there's the Burgergemeinde, which is an association of patrons and burghers of Bern. But we don't have sausages, and that inspired me. I wanna introduce sausages to the Klee Museum. That's missing.
Do it on the summer party, otherwise it doesn't really work. You use a lot of money in selling food.
Okay, so the art newspaper article tomorrow is SingleArtist Museum, people agree, do the sausage party in the summer. You know? So one thing that came up already is Catalogue Raisonné. You presided over for Klee. Did you do Catalogue Raisonné for Munk?
I'd like to say that we are not doing authentications, but we are doing Catalogue Raisonné. But we are very strong introductionary in these catalogues that it cannot be used as a legal document, because that inflicts a lot of troubles, as we have seen. A lot of the SingleArtist museums has been in huge difficulties because they are doing these authentications.
Yes,
so
it's true for the SingleArtist museums and also for the artist-endowed foundations. Many of them, like Warhol Foundation, has famously abandoned authentication because they had so many legal attacks. What about you? Did you create some sort of Catalogue Raisonné, and do you deal with questions about forgeries, fakes? Is that something that you have to think about?
The forgeries are pretty stupid and easy to see, and everybody knows it. But we have a website made 15 years ago, and in the back of the website is a Catalogue Raisonné, but online. And each curators get a password, so they find nearly everything, but we are just perhaps 90% ready. Since 15 years, everything, but the past, I gave so many gifts away as birthday presents, and we are preparing this, but it will be not printed. It will be staying on a hard drive and open for other sources. Mm-hmm. But concerning damages, I repair everything for free. People, as the bronze comes with the back patina, they ship it to the foundry and it gets repaired. That's my service after all these years. But forgeries are so dead stupid that everybody sees it's not a real problem.
So a variety of questions were raised, and I just want to drill down into a few of them. But maybe one sort of question that hasn't been addressed, but I think needs to be addressed is, why go alone? I mean, you know, you have a huge national museum coming in Oslo. You already are alongside a museum. You as an artist could have donated or established a collaboration with the museum. And I'd like to start with Thomas as well, because maybe the temptation, I'm sure there are many museums that should be delighted to have the definitive collection of your work. Why go and do all the sausage stuff and the catalogue raisonné and the...
no, the sausage stuff is with the neighbors who are state institutions, yes. And they are pretty poor.
Yeah, so why not go into a museum?
Because first, I don't trust them. Second, the people who can afford exhibition are private, not state. And the moment when they took over Berlin and were not able to send a letter by post because they have no budget. If I do an exhibition nowadays with the wrong museum, I have to bring the money by myself and bring 90% of the work by myself. So it changed dramatically the last 10, 15 years that the public money is gone just for the staff. Mm-hmm. Just for everything special is financed extrally, and actually each curator does his own thing and the next one does his own thing. There is not much continuity. So I don't remember when the last German museum bought a piece. 12 years ago. It's not a luxury situation, but my luxury situation is that I can generate money on this market, which I don't really like, but I live on this, and this makes it possible to finance the thing by ourselves. And the foundation has no money to run it without me for the next 15 years, which is a pretty good situation.
What about for you? Has that ever come up to just create one organizational entity?
Well, this is what we just done. We created a sort of roof around the Paul Klee Museum and the Kunstmuseum Bern. We're one organization now, because it turned out it makes much more sense to use all the synergies you can generate if you think the Universal Museum in Bern. You always have to be very specific. I think if you think about museums, this is not transferable to any other situation. But for us in Bern, it made much more sense to think both museums together. And of course, think the Paul Klee Museum as a monographically themed place. But we can use so many structures together with the Kunstmuseum and have so much more possibilities with our resources shrinking, to sort of concentrate and have the best output for art and artists, and not spend twice on registrars or twice on accounting. And so for us, this was really a very good structural decision.
We have probably time for a couple of questions quickly. Is there someone who would like to ask a question? I just want to make sure we're not missing the opportunity. This is a short panel, so I'm just going to ask two more questions. One theme that has been constant here is, how do you not turn into a mausoleum? So when you look out at the field of single artist museums, not just yours, where do you see the most innovation? How can you sort of keep this kind of museum alive and integrated into the issues of today, and not just sort of maintain the shrine to these, in your case, dead artists.
If you allow me, I'd like to comment on your last question first, because in 2004 there was a robbery at the Munk Museum that was armed, and the robbers took the Scream and Madonna. And that was a very interesting moment, because that was a moment when the city, the owner of the collection, understood that the responsibility to this collection wasn't local, it was global, because it was journalists from everywhere in the world that was filling up the garden in front of the museum, and that was a shock to the politician that, first of all, the robbery has happened, but also the value and the responsibility of keeping this collection for the, let's say, heritage of the global society. And that's probably why they decided to build this new museum. And I think the aim of and the vision of the National Museum, which is also a prominent museum, is very different from the Munk Museum in that respect. That's a more, let's say, a museum. The responsibility is to take care of Norwegian cultural heritage and the art of art history of Norway and surroundings. So I think it's very different aims. So when it comes to not being a mausoleum, I think that's a challenge that we all deal with on a daily basis, to keep alive and vibrant and see how we can deal with that. If in the manifest that we made in this network, we are actually emphasizing the connection to modern society through contemporary art and contemporary artists, to inspire not only people but also artists around us here and now. So that's an important part of it, but there is of course other parts as well. If you want to look for good examples, I think one thing that happens right now is that you see that one artist museums are developing more space in order to be showing their artists in a wider context, or together with contemporary art, or a wider artistic program. So that's one thing that is happening. Digitalization, of course, is happening in every museum, but also in the SingleArtist Museums. That's a very important part of our work. So I think that there is a lot of development to make sure that your institution is relevant and participate in the development of society on many levels. So I think that challenge is living with us, and we certainly don't want to be a mausoleum.
Yeah, so let's first think, do we know a SingleArtist Museum that has turned into a mausoleum? Like, what do we not want? And I just spoke with Björn Brötnagel before our talk, and he said, an artist just told me there's this Victor Vasarely museum in total decay in southern France. It's so inspiring. The tiles are falling from the walls, and there's water leaks everywhere. It's amazing. So it's inspiring to somebody. Probably a difficult museum to run at the moment. From the description of it, might be completely off. I don't know. This is just what I heard. So I'm happy that we're with Paul Klee. We have an artist at the core of our mission who is really a universalist, and I think a whole period in the 20th century, he is equivalent with modern art per se worldwide. So what I'm trying to explore, and I think this has maybe not been explored enough, is how Paul Klee influenced artistic scenes in other regions of the world. And I'm finding out, and this is like our ongoing research, I'm talking to an Iraqi curator who tells me there's an Iraqi artist who started his entire career on a dialogue with Paul Klee. I talk to a curator who's working on Senga Ngudi, and she tells me she saw in Pasadena as a young woman a Paul Klee exhibition that inspired her work. Charlene van Heil, we have works of her here at the art fair, admires Paul Klee, and I would like to be able to invite these artists to Bern to get them more in touch with Paul Klee and develop projects around a global interest in Paul Klee, and then also help by lending to the right projects. Of course, we also own 1/3 of Paul Klee's work, and it's a great responsibility, I think, on our side to choose which loan requests we should really support. And there's always the temptation of the commercial loan request that can help finance the institution. But then there are also interesting intellectual projects. Like, I'm very happy we were able to support the Neolithic childhood exhibition at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt around Karl Einstein, who really helped our curatorial team, our research team, to understand better, because they went so far with how they researched Karl Einstein and his relationship with Paul Klee, that the works are going to return to us, and we were able to change certain ideas. So I think a good mix between these approaches is really what we're hoping to realize in the future.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I'm going to have just a closing question, very short. One thing I think has become apparent in this very short introduction to these museums, that they come in many shapes and sizes, and they're not standing still, and they often really begin on the initiative of very specific individuals that really launch them into the world. As a last question, I just want to say we are about to see the passing away of one of the largest and the wealthiest generations of artists. We are, every few months, we hear a famous major artist who is passing away. And so I think we can safely predict that more single artist museums are coming. As a closing question for each of you, what is the one advice, based on all the issues we discussed today, that you would give to those artists or to their families or to their supporters who are trying to establish these museums, so that to ensure that these entities will be viable over the long term? Maybe we'll start with you and we come this way.
That's a difficult question, of course, but I think one important aspect I have experienced in this network is that it's very important that the people that are responsible or owns the legacy in terms of collections and other museum objects needs to professionalize, needs to hand it over to professional people that can develop the research and the exhibition program and the lending program and all these things on a professional international level, because there is a lot of anxiety from families and relatives and others that want to, let's say, not interfere. Of course, it's a very legal, appropriate position to have, to take this responsibility very personally. But on the other hand, I see that that could be a restriction or restrict the possibility of actually presenting the artist and dealing with the necessary research and digitalization and all the things that you need to do in order to keep the artist alive and a parent in a global artistic world.
Nina, what's your advice?
2 exhibition rooms, not 1 exhibition room. So you're always flexible with your programming, and sausages in the summer.
Thomas, what advice would you give to your fellow artists when they're considering establishing a museum?
My advice is, don't make the mistake of others. It's shocking how conventional artwork got the last 15 years. And you never know what survives, if it's money, if it's fame, is it quality, anyway. And the advice is, don't be too selfish, give it all away.
I don't think we could have ended with a better line than that. Thank you very much to all 3 of you, and thank you to all. Enjoy the show.
Thank you.